The morning started like any other. The sun was just peeking over the trees, casting soft light across the quiet neighborhood. Birds chirped, and a gentle breeze moved through the streets lined with neatly kept houses. Everything looked normal, calm, and safe. The homeowner, a person who always tried to follow the rules and live peacefully, was sipping coffee and watching the morning unfold from the porch. Their house had always been cared for, with flowers in the garden and the lawn mowed on schedule. They had never caused trouble and had always respected the community. That morning, something unusual happened. A loud knock came at the front door. It was unusual because the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, and most people rarely received visitors so early. When they opened the door, there were two police officers standing there, looking serious. The homeowner felt a chill run down their spine. They had never had any trouble with the law or the neighborhood. They didn't understand why the police were at their doorstep, the officers explained. That they were there because a complaint had been made against them. The homeowner was confused. They asked what the complaint was, and the officers read it from a small piece of paper. It said that the homeowner had violated the HOA rules. That alone surprised them, because they thought they knew and followed every rule the community had. The complaint claimed that a small change to their property was not allowed. The change was minor, nothing that would hurt anyone, but apparently someone felt it was wrong enough to call the police. The homeowner felt a mixture of emotions: shock, fear, and frustration. They tried to explain politely that they didn't think what they did was breaking any rule. But the officers said they had to document the complaint and check it out. The situation felt strange. The police were calm and professional, but it felt wrong to be in trouble for something so small, something that was not harmful in any way. The homeowner tried to stay composed, but inside, anxiety was growing. After the officers left, the homeowner started thinking about what had happened. They tried to make sense of it. Why would someone go so far as to involve the police over something so minor? They began to remember small incidents with neighbors that had felt tense, small moments where people had been overly critical or judgmental. At first, it seemed normal. They thought it was just personalities clashing. But now, it felt like something bigger was going on. It wasn't just about rules. It felt like someone wanted to intimidate them, to make them feel uncomfortable in their own home. The day continued, but it didn't feel normal anymore. Every sound outside, the crunch of tires on the street, the voices of neighbors walking by felt charged with tension. They went through the HOA documents again, checking every rule, every regulation, trying to find where they might have gone wrong. Everything seemed clear. They had not broken any rule intentionally, and most of the rules didn't even mention the small change they had made. It became clear that the complaint was probably based on someone's personal opinion rather than actual policy. Feeling frustrated but determined, they started making a list of everything that had happened, every interaction, every notice. And every letter from the HOA, they knew that if things escalated, they needed to be ready. They didn't want to fight for no reason, but they also didn't want to be bullied. There was a sense growing inside them that they were about to uncover something deeper than just a minor disagreement. Something about the HOA felt unfair, but it wasn't visible yet. They needed more information. That afternoon, they walked around the neighborhood, talking quietly to neighbors they trusted. Most people were hesitant to discuss the HOA, and a few even warned them to be careful. But one or two shared small stories about similar situations, little complaints that seemed harmless but had led to warnings or fines. It became clear that the complaint against them was not an isolated incident. Other residents had been in similar situations but had stayed quiet because they were afraid of confrontation or repercussions. The homeowner felt a mix of emotions: anger at being unfairly targeted, but also a sense of responsibility. They realized that if they didn't stand up, the pattern would continue and no one would know what was really happening. They began thinking carefully about their next steps. Documentation, conversations with neighbors, checking the rules, all these small steps started to form a plan. They didn't want to be seen as difficult, but they also knew that silence would allow unfair treatment to continue. That evening, as they sat on the porch again, the sun setting and the neighborhood quieting down, they reflected on the day. A day that started ordinary had turned into a day of realization. They understood that they were facing more than just a minor complaint. They were facing a system that had the power to control intimidate, and enforce rules in ways that were not always fair. The police visit was just the beginning, a signal that what seemed small could escalate if not addressed thoughtfully. They made a decision to proceed carefully, calmly, and intelligently. They would gather evidence, talk to neighbors, and learn everything about the HOA rules and history. They were determined not to let fear dictate their actions. The experience had shaken them, but it also ignited a sense of resolve. They were going to handle this situation in a way that was fair, reasonable, and above all, based on truth. They understood that this was bigger than themselves, and by standing firm, they might help others in the community who had also been silenced or intimidated. That night, sleep was difficult. Their mind kept replaying the knock on the door, the police officers' faces, and the words of the complaint. The homeowner thought about the nature of authority, how easily power could be misused, and how one small act of complaint could ripple into something much larger. They realized that even in a peaceful neighborhood, control could be exercised unfairly, and sometimes, people had to fight quietly to maintain fairness and honesty. The day had begun with routine, and it ended with a quiet determination to face what was coming next. Whatever that might be, the next morning, the homeowner woke up with a sense of unease. The events of the previous day had left a deep impression, and now everything felt different. Even small sounds, like the rustling of leaves or the footsteps of neighbors, seemed louder and more significant. They had spent hours thinking about the police visit and reviewing HOA documents late into the night. The feeling of being watched or judged by invisible eyes lingered. Determined to act carefully, the homeowner began documenting everything in detail. Every letter, every email, every small notice from the HOA was carefully noted, with dates, times, and descriptions. They even began taking photos of the changes made to the property, just to prove that nothing was harmful or disruptive. Each time they looked at the complaint, it felt more like an attempt to intimidate than a real concern. It was a strange feeling being targeted for something so small and reasonable as the days passed. The homeowner started noticing subtle behaviors from neighbors. Some avoided eye contact, while others whispered quietly when passing by. There was a clear sense that people were cautious, afraid to get involved. The homeowner realized that fear had a strong hold in this community, and the HOA seemed to wield power in ways that kept residents quiet. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. One afternoon, a neighbor approached cautiously, speaking in low tones. They shared their own experiences with the HOA, revealing that they too had received fines for minor issues that seemed arbitrary. They spoke about the frustration of trying to comply with unclear rules, constant fear of penalties, and the feeling of being watched. The homeowner listened carefully, realizing that the problem was bigger than a single complaint. This was a pattern of behavior, one that affected many residents. The homeowner decided to investigate further. They began reviewing old HOA meeting minutes, looking for any signs of consistent enforcement or bias. What they found was troubling. Many decisions were made without proper communication. Some rules were applied inconsistently, and complaints often lacked clear evidence. Some board members seemed to push personal agendas rather than focus on the welfare of the community. It became clear that the system was designed to give power to a few, leaving others feeling intimidated and vulnerable. As this realization grew, the homeowner felt both anger and resolve. It was unfair that residents were subjected to selective enforcement. And the police visit had highlighted just how easily someone could use authority to intimidate others. The homeowner knew they needed to act carefully but firmly. They couldn't allow fear to dictate their actions. They began planning their approach, focusing on careful documentation, clear communication, and gathering allies quietly. They reached out to a few neighbors who had shown support in subtle ways, asking if they had also experienced unfair treatment. Slowly, a small network of residents began to share their experiences. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation, but others were willing to speak up. Together, they realized that collective awareness could provide some protection against the arbitrary power of the HOA. There was comfort in knowing they were not alone. But there was still a long road ahead. Meanwhile, the HOA continued its usual correspondence. Letters and emails arrived, repeating warnings about rules and regulations, sometimes contradicting themselves or referring to vague policies. The homeowner responded professionally and calmly, providing documentation and asking for clarification. They avoided anger or confrontation, focusing instead on facts and evidence. Each response was carefully crafted, with copies kept for records. The process was exhausting, but necessary. It was a slow, meticulous effort to protect themselves while exposing the flaws in the system. One day, a representative from the HOA requested an in-person meeting. The homeowner agreed, understanding that it could be an opportunity to present their evidence and seek a resolution. During the meeting, they calmly explained the situation, showing documents, photos, and correspondence. The representatives listened, but seemed defensive, offering vague explanations and avoiding accountability. It became clear that they were not used to residents challenging their authority in such a structured and careful manner. The homeowner left the meeting with a stronger sense that change would require persistence and courage. The experience was emotionally draining. Each interaction with the HOA reminded the homeowner of the power imbalance and the subtle intimidation tactics used to control residents. Yet, it also strengthened their determination. They realized that standing up to the HOA was not just about their own property or rights, but about exposing unfair practices and protecting the community. It became a mission, fueled by the belief that transparency and truth could bring fairness to a system that had been misused. In the evenings, the homeowner would reflect on the day's events, sometimes feeling exhausted but also focused. They maintained a calm and collected demeanor in public, but inside, they were thinking strategically. Each letter, each phone call, each minor interaction was a piece of a larger puzzle. They were learning the importance of patience, careful documentation, and calm communication. It was not just a fight, it was a process of revealing truth and standing firm. Over time, the homeowner noticed that some neighbors began to quietly acknowledge their efforts, offering support in subtle ways. A smile here, a quiet word there, small signs that others were paying attention and perhaps inspired to speak up themselves. It was a reminder that courage could be contagious, and that even in a community dominated by fear, one person's careful and consistent actions could make a difference. The situation remained tense, but the homeowner had found a sense of control. They were no longer a passive target of arbitrary rules. By documenting, questioning, and calmly responding, they were reclaiming agency. Each day was a test of patience and resilience, but also a step toward fairness. The police visit had been the first shock, the wake-up call that revealed the HOA's influence. Now, the homeowner was actively learning how to navigate and challenge that influence without causing unnecessary conflict. As the days turned into weeks, the homeowner began to understand the deeper lessons. Power, when unchecked, could be misused. Fear could silence people. But careful preparation, calm reasoning, and persistent documentation could provide protection and eventually expose injustice. They were learning how to balance caution with courage, fear with resolve. Every letter written, every meeting attended, every conversation with neighbors was part of a growing strategy. The journey was not easy. There were moments of doubt, fatigue, and frustration. Yet, each challenge also reinforced the homeowner's commitment to fairness and transparency. They were becoming more confident in their ability to navigate the complex dynamics of the HOA, and more determined to stand up not just for themselves, but for anyone else who had suffered quietly. The experience was shaping them, teaching resilience, patience, and the quiet power of careful action. By the end of the part of this story, the homeowner had turned fear into determination. The police visit had been a shocking beginning, but it was only the start of uncovering deeper issues. The HOA's arbitrary enforcement and subtle intimidation were becoming clearer, and the homeowner was taking steps to address it thoughtfully and effectively. What had begun as confusion and anxiety was transforming into focused action and quiet courage, setting the stage for further revelations and the eventual exposure of the HOA's misconduct as the days passed. The homeowner realized that responding to the HOA and documenting incidents was only part of the challenge. The bigger task was understanding the system itself, They began spending long hours researching the HOA's structure, rules, and past actions. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating process, filled with legal jargon and vague language, but they were determined. They knew that knowledge was power, and if they could uncover patterns, they might understand why they had been singled out. The homeowner started by examining past HOA meeting notes and newsletters that had been distributed to residents. They discovered discrepancies. Some rules were applied inconsistently, and certain actions were penalized for some residents but overlooked for others. This selective enforcement seemed arbitrary at first, but as they read more, a pattern began to emerge. The board seemed to target residents who questioned authority or made minor changes without explicit permission. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who didn't pay attention. But it was real. Encouraged by this discovery, the homeowner started reaching out quietly to other residents who had been through similar experiences. They were cautious, careful not to alarm anyone, but found that many had stories to share. Some had been fined for small infractions, like planting flowers in a certain spot or painting shutters a slightly different color. Others had been warned for activities that seemed harmless. Most residents had simply accepted it, afraid to challenge the board for fear of retaliation or fines. One neighbor shared a story about a past incident where the board had demanded the removal of a small garden statue, claiming it violated aesthetics rules. The resident complied without protest, but later discovered that other neighbors with similar statues were never questioned. Another neighbor had been forced to repaint their house after a complaint, even though the color had been approved years before. Listening to these stories, the homeowner realized that the system wasn't about maintaining standards, it was about controlling residents and reinforcing authority. The homeowner decided to dig deeper. They requested public records, copies of board decisions, and emails sent to residents. Some of the responses were slow or incomplete, but persistence paid off. They found communications that showed selective enforcement and sometimes vague threats that were never backed by clear rules. The more they learned, the more they understood that their own situation was part of a larger pattern, not a personal vendetta as they had initially feared. While gathering this information, the homeowner also reflected on their own interactions with the HOA. They remembered each warning, each letter, each visit, and started piecing together how the board had used rules selectively. The realization was both frustrating and empowering. They saw that this was not just a small problem, it was a system that had the power to intimidate, control, and silence residents who dared to question it. They also began documenting these findings carefully. Every conversation, every letter, and every pattern they discovered was noted with dates, times, and details. They even created a timeline of events connecting their own experiences to those of other residents. This was not just for their own protection, but for clarity, so that if the situation escalated, they would have concrete evidence of the patterns of behavior and selective enforcement. The homeowner noticed that the more they understood, the more confident they became. They no longer felt like a passive target of intimidation, but as someone who could use facts and have documentation to protect themselves and others. They started considering ways to share their findings without creating unnecessary conflict, but in a manner that could hold the board accountable. This was a delicate balance. They wanted to expose the issues without provoking retaliatory action that could affect them or their neighbors. In the evenings, they often spoke quietly with neighbors, exchanging stories and evidence. These conversations built trust and a sense of community, even though fear still lingered. Residents began to see that they were not alone, the board's actions were not justified, and that careful, calm action could make a difference. The homeowner found a small sense of solidarity that had been missing in the neighborhood. It was quiet, but it was real, and it strengthened their resolve. Meanwhile, HOA continued sending letters and warnings. Each new correspondence was met with calm, detailed responses from the homeowner. They provided evidence, asked for clarification, and highlighted inconsistencies. They were careful to maintain a professional tone, avoiding anger or emotional responses, knowing that these documents could become crucial if the situation escalated further. Each interaction was another opportunity to expose the pattern of selective enforcement and intimidation. One afternoon, the homeowner attended another HOA meeting. this time armed with evidence and a clear understanding of the rules and past actions. The board seemed tense, perhaps sensing that this resident was no longer easily intimidated. They presented their findings calmly, pointing out inconsistencies, selective enforcement, and vague threats in past correspondence. Some board members tried to deflect, but the homeowner remained focused, providing facts and examples without raising their voice. It was a turning point, showing that the board could be challenged through careful preparation and calm reasoning. After the meeting, a few residents approached the homeowner quietly. They expressed gratitude and shared their own experiences of unfair treatment. Some said they had been afraid to speak up, but seeing someone confront the HOA so calmly and thoroughly inspired them. The homeowner realized that their actions had a ripple effect. By standing firm, they were not only protecting themselves, but also empowering others who had been silenced by fear. The homeowner continued their investigation. Even outside the immediate neighborhood, they looked into state laws, local ordinances, and legal precedents related to homeowners associations. They wanted to understand the full extent of what the HOA could and could not do. Each piece of information added clarity, and slowly, the homeowner began to see a path forward. They could challenge unfair practices, expose patterns of selective enforcement, and advocate for transparency and fairness without putting themselves or neighbors at undue risk, even as they gained confidence. The homeowner remained cautious. They knew the HOA had power and could react unpredictably. Every step was measured, every response deliberate. They learned patience, resilience, and the importance of maintaining a calm, factual approach. Each new discovery was another piece of evidence, another opportunity to hold the board accountable. Over time, the homeowner's efforts began to shift the dynamic. While the HOA still maintained authority, residents started noticing the documentation, consistency, and the careful approach to challenging unfair practices. Small signs of change appeared, questions being answered more clearly, letters becoming more precise, and a slight reduction in arbitrary fines. The homeowner understood that real change would take time, but even small victories were significant. As the homeowner reflected on their journey so far, they felt a growing sense of purpose. What had begun as a confusing and frightening police visit had become a mission to expose unfair practices and protect the community. They had learned that courage was not loud or confrontational, but calm, careful, and consistent. By documenting, investigating, and sharing knowledge, they had begun to turn fear into action and frustration into empowerment. This was only the beginning. The homeowner knew that more challenges lay ahead. There would be pushback, resistance, and attempts to maintain control. But now, with knowledge, evidence, and a growing network of supportive neighbors, they felt ready to face whatever came next. The journey had transformed them from a passive resident into someone capable of standing up to authority, advocating for fairness, and inspiring others to do the same. They were no longer just responding to the HOA. They were shaping the future of the community in a quiet but powerful way. The homeowner felt a sense of determination that had been building steadily. They knew that the next step would be challenging but necessary. The evidence they had gathered over weeks of research, careful documentation, and conversations with neighbors formed a clear picture. The HOA had been selectively enforcing rules, intimidating residents, and creating an environment of fear. It was time to confront the system directly. But with calm and precision, they started by organizing all the information into a clear and comprehensive presentation. Emails, letters, photographs, meeting notes, and personal accounts from neighbors were arranged in a timeline that demonstrated patterns of selective enforcement. Each piece of evidence was carefully labeled and cross-referenced. The homeowner knew that chaos or emotion could weaken their case, so they made sure that every point was backed by facts, dates, and documentation. The homeowner scheduled a formal meeting with the HOA board. They approached it with a calm, professional attitude, knowing that their demeanor would be just as important as the evidence they presented. On the day of the meeting, they arrived early, reviewed their notes one last time, and set up the materials in a way that was easy to follow and hard to dismiss. They understood that the board might try to deflect or intimidate, but they were prepared to remain focused on facts and clarity. As the meeting began, the board members seemed tense, perhaps sensing that this resident was no longer intimidated by their authority. The homeowner spoke slowly, clearly, and without anger. They walked the board through each piece of evidence, showing examples of inconsistent rule enforcement and vague complaints that had been used to threaten or intimidate residents. They included accounts from neighbors who had shared similar experiences, emphasizing that these were not isolated incidents, but a recurring pattern. Some board members tried to interrupt or explain away the inconsistencies, but the homeowner remained calm and composed. They responded politely but firmly, reiterating the facts and requesting clarification on the rules and decisions. They made it clear that the goal was not to attack the board personally, but to ensure transparency, fairness, and proper application of rules. This approach put pressure on the board in a way that was difficult to dismiss because it was grounded entirely in evidence and logic. As the discussion continued, the homeowner noticed subtle shifts in the room. Some board members avoided eye contact. Others seemed flustered by the thorough presentation. The homeowner remained calm, understanding that this was an important moment. They could see that careful preparation, consistency, and calm persistence were creating tension and forcing the board to calm from their own actions. It was a reminder that power could be challenged when backed by facts and careful planning. After presenting all the evidence, the homeowner asked specific questions. They wanted the board to address the inconsistencies and explain the reasons behind selective enforcement. Some board members gave vague answers or attempted to redirect the conversation, but the homeowner stayed on point. They calmly repeated the questions and referred back to documented examples, ensuring there was no room for avoidance. Each response from the board was noted carefully, adding to the record that could be used later if necessary. One resident, who had been quietly observing, quietly nodded in agreement with the homeowner's points. Another resident whispered about their own experience, which added weight to the argument without causing public confrontation. The homeowner realized that by presenting evidence carefully and maintaining composure, they were not only defending themselves, but also empowering others in the community to speak up. It was a subtle but powerful shift in the neighborhood dynamic. By the end of the meeting, the homeowner had made their case clearly and firmly. They had documented the HOA's selective enforcement, gathered neighbor support, and asked pointed questions that required accountability. The board members left the room visibly unsettled, perhaps recognizing that the homeowner had exposed a pattern that they could no longer easily ignore. It was a quiet victory, achieved not through confrontation, but through meticulous preparation and calm presentation. After the meeting, the homeowner continued to follow up with the HOA. Emails were sent requesting written clarification on policies, explanations for past actions, and assurances that future enforcement would be fair and consistent. Each communication was professional, polite, and backed by evidence. This ongoing documentation created a record that could not be easily disputed and added pressure for the HOA to act transparently. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. Some approached the homeowner quietly, expressing relief that someone was standing up for fairness. Others shared their own experiences and offered additional documentation or anecdotes. Slowly, a sense of solidarity developed, even though fear still lingered. The homeowner understood that community support was a crucial element in challenging an entrenched system, and the quiet strength of the neighborhood was beginning to emerge. The homeowner also reached out to local authorities and legal advisors to understand the limits of HOA power and ensure that any actions taken were within legal boundaries. They learned that while HOAs had significant authority, their actions were subject to state and local laws, and selective enforcement or intimidation could be challenged legally. This knowledge reinforced their confidence and provided additional tools to hold the board accountable. As the weeks progressed, the HOA began to respond differently. Letters and warnings were now more detailed, with references to specific rules and proper documentation. While the behavior did not change entirely, the homeowner could see that their efforts were influencing the board's approach. The pattern of arbitrary enforcement was beginning to shift, demonstrating that careful, calm, and consistent action could make a real difference. Throughout this process, the homeowner remained focused on the broader goal: fairness, transparency, and protection for all residents. They knew that exposing the system would not be easy and that resistance would continue, but they also understood that the power of documentation, preparation, and calm persistence could not be ignored. Each meeting, each email, each conversation with neighbors was a step toward accountability and change. By the end of this stage, the homeowner felt a growing sense of accomplishment. What began as a frightening police visit and a confusing complaint had turned into a mission to challenge unfair practices and protect the community. The HOA could no longer act without scrutiny, and residents who had felt powerless were beginning to see that they had a voice. The homeowner realized that standing firm, remaining calm, and relying on evidence could transform fear into empowerment and frustration into tangible results. The journey was far from over, but Part 4 had demonstrated a turning point. The homeowner had confronted the HOA directly, exposed inconsistencies, and started to shift the power dynamic. The foundation for accountability and eventual resolution had been laid, setting the stage for the next and final part of the story, where the HOA's misconduct would be fully exposed, and the homeowner's courage and persistence would bring meaningful change to the community. The final part of the journey began quietly, with the homeowner reviewing all the evidence they had collected over the past weeks. Every email, letter, and conversation had been carefully documented. Now it was time to see the results of their persistence. The homeowner understood that change would not happen overnight, but the groundwork was set, and the neighborhood was ready to see accountability take place. It started with another formal meeting. This time, the homeowner was not alone. Several neighbors who had previously shared their experiences joined them, each bringing their own documentation and examples of unfair treatment. The room was tense, but the homeowner felt a sense of calm confidence. They had spent weeks preparing, understanding the rules, and gathering evidence. Now, they were ready to present the full story. As the meeting began, the homeowner spoke clearly and steadily. They explained the patterns of selective enforcement, intimidation, and vague warnings that the board had used against residents. Each point was backed with facts, dates, and examples. Neighbors added their own stories, showing that this was not an isolated incident. The collective evidence made it impossible for the board to ignore the truth. For the first time, HOA had to face not just one voice, but a group of residents, demanding fairness and transparency. Some board members attempted to downplay the issues, offering explanations that were vague or inconsistent. The homeowner responded calmly, referring back to the documentation and pointing out the contradictions. Every attempt to deflect was met with facts, and the discussion became increasingly focused on accountability. The homeowner could see that their careful preparation and calm approach were forcing the board to confront their actions in a way that was uncomfortable but necessary. During the meeting, a key point emerged. The HOA had acted outside of its own rules and regulations. Several past decisions had no clear basis in the bylaws, and some fines and warnings had been issued without proper notice or justification. The homeowner highlighted these points with clear evidence, showing that the board had overstepped its authority. The room was quiet as the board members realized that their actions could no longer be hidden or ignored after presenting all the evidence. The homeowner made specific requests. They asked for written clarification on all rules, the removal of any arbitrary fines, and assurances that future enforcement would be fair and consistent. They also requested that the board acknowledge the mistakes that had been made and take steps to prevent similar issues in the future. These requests were not confrontational. They were reasonable, factual, and aimed at restoring fairness to the community. Over the next few days, the homeowner followed up with emails and additional documentation. They made it clear that accountability was expected and that residents were watching closely. The neighborhood, previously quiet and hesitant, began to show signs of collective awareness. More residents came forward, sharing experiences and supporting the homeowner's efforts. Fear began to give way to a sense of empowerment, as people realized that standing up for fairness was possible when approached calmly and strategically. Eventually, the HOA responded with formal statements. Some fines were rescinded, letters were clarified, and the board committed to more transparent procedures. A few members resigned or were removed, and new guidelines were established to ensure fair and consistent enforcement. The homeowners' efforts had forced a tangible change, proving that persistence, documentation, and careful action could hold even powerful systems accountable. The transformation in the community was noticeable. Residents who had once been fearful now spoke openly about their concerns. Conversations that had previously been hushed became part of regular discussions. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted from one of tension and caution to one of transparency and cautious optimism. The homeowner realized that the impact of their actions went beyond their own property. They had helped create a culture where fairness and accountability mattered, reflecting on the entire experience. The homeowner felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The police visit, which had seemed frightening and unfair at first, had been the catalyst for uncovering a much larger problem. What began as a small complaint had led to the exposure of patterns of selective enforcement and intimidation. It was a reminder that, even in situations where authority seems overwhelming, careful preparation, calm persistence, and community support can make a real difference. The homeowner also understood the personal growth that had come from the experience. They had learned patience, resilience, and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. They had seen how documentation, evidence, and logical reasoning could protect them from arbitrary power. Perhaps most importantly, it learned that standing up for fairness was not just about oneself. It was about creating a positive impact for the entire community. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to a more normal rhythm. Residents were more confident in their interactions with the HOA, and the board's actions were more transparent and accountable. The homeowner continued to monitor developments, ready to respond if necessary, but there was a sense that the balance of power had shifted. Fairness, once lacking, was now a visible priority. Looking back, the homeowner reflected on how a single, unexpected police visit had changed everything. It had revealed the hidden dynamics of the HOA, sparked investigation and dialogue, and ultimately led to meaningful change. What had seemed like a frightening and confusing incident became the turning point for accountability, community solidarity, and personal growth. The story ended not with conflict, but with the quiet triumph of preparation, persistence, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The homeowner understood that this experience would be remembered by the community for a long time. The lessons learned about fairness, persistence, and the importance of standing up to misuse of authority were not just theoretical. They were lived experiences that had reshaped the neighborhood and empowered residents to protect their rights. The journey had begun with fear and confusion but ended with clarity, change, and a renewed sense of trust in the power of evidence, community, and calm determination. Months had passed since the homeowner had successfully challenged the HOA and exposed the unfair practices that had caused so much tension in the neighborhood. Life began to settle into a new rhythm, but the lessons of the past lingered. The homeowner reflected on how a single incident, having the police called over a minor complaint, had led to a journey of understanding, courage, and community change. It was clear that the story was not just about rules or fines. It was about accountability, fairness, and the power of persistence. The homeowner started noticing subtle changes around the neighborhood. Residents who had once seemed cautious and distant now greeted each other with smiles and friendly words. Conversations about rules and enforcement became more open, with neighbors sharing experiences and helping each other navigate the HOA guidelines. A sense of trust was gradually returning, and there was a noticeable reduction in fear of retaliation. The homeowner realized that their actions had not only protected their own rights, but it also sparked a quiet transformation in the community. In the following weeks, the homeowner continued to monitor the HOA's activities. They noticed that the board had begun providing clearer explanations for decisions and were now documenting rule enforcement more thoroughly. Letters and notices were more precise and transparent, and the tone had shifted from intimidating to professional. It was evident that the HOA had learned that residents were now paying attention and were willing to hold them accountable. The homeowner felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that careful action and evidence-based challenges could change even entrenched systems. Beyond the administrative changes, there were social shifts as well. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak up began attending HOA meetings more regularly. They asked questions, offered suggestions, and even volunteered for committees. The homeowner observed these changes with pride, recognizing that the fear that had gripped the community was being replaced by participation and engagement. People were reclaiming a sense of agency, understanding that their voices mattered, and that collective action could lead to fairness.